One moment of peace. One act of violence. One truth that changes everything. When Isabella Green's tranquil evening in Maplewood Park is shattered by Officer Greg Nolan's abuse of power, her world collapses. Her husband, Lucas Carter, a respected police captain with a reputation for rooting out corruption, steps in to protect her, but his authority becomes his downfall. Arrested and brutalized by his own colleagues, Lucas finds himself caught in a dark web of systemic betrayal. While Isabella fights to expose the truth, she uncovers a vendetta that runs deeper than they ever imagined. A family secret that ties Greg's hatred directly to Lucas's past. As tensions rise and the truth begins to surface, Lucas and Isabella must decide. How far will they go to seek justice? And when the truth comes to light, will it bring redemption or destruction? The Silent Badge is a gripping tale of power, betrayal, and the unbreakable strength of love, with a twist that will leave you breathless. What if the fight for justice meant uncovering the lies that bind your own family? The warm hues of sunset stretched across Maplewood Park, painting the trees and winding paths in golden light. Isabella Green exhaled deeply, sinking into the bench as the breeze teased strands of her wavy black hair. This was her sanctuary, a rare reprieve from the demands of her work as a schoolteacher. She adjusted her soft shawl, letting her eyes close momentarily. Her phone buzzed on the bench beside her. She glanced at it and smiled. A half-typed message to Lucas, her husband, lingered on the screen. At the park, waiting for you. Love you. She hesitated, deciding not to send it just yet. For now, she would savor the calm, the sound of laughter from nearby children, and the distant hum of the city. The moment shattered as a shadow fell over her. Isabella opened her eyes to see a man in a police uniform standing before her. His badge gleamed in the fading sunlight, but something in his stance felt too casual, too invasive. "Good evening," the man said, his voice smooth but carrying an edge. "Beautiful evening, isn't it?" Isabella nodded politely. "Yes, it is." She shifted slightly, her instincts on high alert as he took a step closer. The officer's name tag read Greg Nolan. He didn't leave. Instead, he sat beside her, closer than she liked, his pale blue eyes scanning her face. "You come here often?" he asked, his tone conversational but with a hint of something else. "Sometimes," Isabella replied, keeping her tone neutral. She glanced around, hoping someone else might notice, but the park had begun to empty as the day gave way to twilight. "It's rare to meet someone like you." He leaned closer, his hand resting casually on the bench near her leg. Her heart raced. "I'm just waiting for my husband," she said firmly, leaning away. Greg raised an eyebrow, his smirk unfaltering. "I didn't mean to intrude," he said, though his hand inched closer, brushing against her knee. Isabella froze. "Excuse me," she said sharply, rising to her feet. But before she could move, his hand clamped on her shoulder. "Don't be so unfriendly," he hissed, shoving her back. She stumbled and fell hard onto the gravel path, pain shooting through her wrist and shoulder. Greg loomed over her, his expression darkening. "Next time, be more polite," he sneered. "Isabella." The familiar voice broke through her shock. Isabella looked up to see Lucas sprinting toward her, his tall frame cutting a sharp figure in his dark jacket. His piercing blue eyes took in the scene. Isabella on the ground, Greg standing over her, smug and unapologetic. Lucas's protective fury boiled to the surface as he reached Isabella, crouching to help her up. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice taut with anger and worry. "I'm fine," she said shakily, clutching her sore wrist. Lucas turned to Greg. "What the hell is going on here?" Greg didn't flinch. "This is a private matter," he said coolly. Lucas straightened, his jaw tightening. "You don't know who you're talking to. I'm Captain Lucas Carter, and that's my wife you just assaulted." Greg's eyes flickered with surprise before narrowing. "Captain or not, you're interfering with an officer's duty," he said, stepping closer. Lucas didn't back down. "Duty? Is that what you call this?" He gestured to Isabella, who stood trembling beside him. Greg's smirk deepened. "If you have a complaint, take it up with the department. But right now, you're in my way. He pulled his radio from his belt. Backup requested. I've got a disruptive civilian refusing to comply. Minutes later, the shrill wail of sirens cut through the air. 2 patrol cars screeched to a stop near the park entrance. Officers emerged, their confusion evident as they approached the scene. Arrest him, Greg ordered, pointing at Lucas. The officers hesitated, their eyes darting between Greg and Lucas. What exactly happened here? One asked, his tone uncertain. Don't question me, Greg snapped. This man interfered with my investigation and got aggressive. Lucas stepped forward, holding up his badge. I'm Captain Lucas Carter. This is a blatant abuse of power. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, but ultimately moved toward Lucas. Sir, please cooperate, one said hesitantly. Isabella's voice trembled as she tried to intervene. He's telling the truth. That officer attacked me. Step back, ma'am, one of the officers said, his tone firm but regretful. Lucas remained calm as the officers grabbed his arms, though his frustration was evident. You're making a mistake, he said, his voice low and controlled. Greg watched with satisfaction as Lucas was handcuffed and pushed toward the patrol car. Maybe next time you'll learn to respect authority, he said smugly. The door of the patrol car slammed shut behind Lucas, and Isabella stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. Greg approached her, his smirk returning. Looks like you'll be waiting a while, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Isabella's fists clenched. You won't get away with this, she said, her voice steady despite the fear swirling inside her. Greg chuckled. Good luck proving anything. As the patrol car drove away, Lucas sat in the back seat, his wrists aching from the cuffs. He stared out the window, his mind racing. The precinct loomed ahead, its lights cold and unwelcoming. This isn't over, Lucas thought, his jaw set. Isabella stood rooted to the spot, the gravel biting into her shoes. Her pain and fear began to harden into determination. I won't let this end here. Lucas's head throbbed as the patrol car jolted to a stop. The precinct parking garage was dimly lit, the concrete walls echoing every sound. Officer Brown yanked the car door open. Out, Brown barked, grabbing Lucas by the arm. Lucas winced but didn't resist. He stepped out, his shoulders straight despite the handcuffs cutting into his wrists. His sharp blue eyes met Brown's hardened gaze. You think this makes you strong? Lucas asked quietly. Brown grunted, shoving Lucas toward the elevator. Officer Reed, silent as always, followed behind. The young man's eyes flickered with discomfort, but he said nothing. The elevator ride was silent except for the faint hum of machinery. Lucas noticed Reed's fidgeting hands. You know this is wrong, he said softly, fixing his gaze on Reed. Reed's throat bobbed as he swallowed. He didn't respond, but his eyes darted toward Brown nervously. The doors slid open, revealing a dim hallway. Lucas's jaw tightened. He knew where they were headed, the basement interrogation rooms. The cold air hit him like a slap as they approached a door marked with peeling paint. Inside, Brown growled, unlocking the heavy door and shoving Lucas forward. Lucas stumbled but caught himself, glaring over his shoulder. You're better than this, Brown, he said calmly. Or have you sold your integrity to the likes of Greg Nolan? Brown's expression faltered, but he quickly masked it. Sit, he snapped, ignoring the jab. Reed avoided Lucas's eyes as they cuffed him to the metal loop on the chair. Lucas exhaled, steeling himself as the door slammed shut, leaving him alone with the oppressive silence. The door creaked open a short while later. Greg Nolan stepped in, his polished boots echoing off the concrete floor. A cruel smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. Well, look at you, Greg said, circling Lucas like a predator. Captain Lucas Carter. Not so high and mighty now, are you? Lucas didn't flinch. He sat upright, his icy gaze locked on Greg. If you think this intimidates me, you're mistaken. Greg laughed, a low, mocking sound. You don't get it, do you? This isn't about intimidation. He leaned closer, his voice dropping. This is personal. Lucas frowned, the first sign of confusion breaking through his calm demeanor. Personal? Greg's expression darkened, his smirk disappearing. Do you remember years ago? The officer you threw off the force? James Nolan. My brother. Lucas blinked, recognition dawning. Your brother got himself expelled for theft. That was his doing, not mine. Greg's face twisted with anger. You ruined him. He slammed his fist against the table, the sound reverberating through the room. You sat on your high horse, pretending to be the moral compass for this precinct, and you destroyed him. Lucas held his ground. Your brother destroyed himself. I don't regret holding him accountable, and I won't regret holding you accountable either. Greg laughed bitterly, stepping back. You still don't understand. You think anyone will believe you after today? I control this place. These men, you think they'll take your side? Lucas's silence spoke volumes. Greg smiled, relishing the moment. I'm going to enjoy watching you fall, Greg said, turning on his heel and leaving Lucas alone again. Isabella sat on the edge of their bed, her injured wrist wrapped in a brace. The house was eerily quiet. She hadn't slept, not after watching Lucas shoved into that patrol car. Her phone rang, the sound jarring in the silence. She grabbed it, answering quickly. Hello? It's Claire, said a calm but urgent voice. Claire was Lucas's lawyer and an old friend of theirs. Claire, they took him. They arrested Lucas, Isabella said, her voice trembling. I know, Claire replied. I saw the footage online. I'll come over first thing in the morning, but we need evidence to fight this. Isabella took a shaky breath. I'll find it. Be careful, Claire warned. If Greg Nolan's involved, you're dealing with someone dangerous. Isabella hung up, her mind whirling. I won't let them get away with this. She stood, wincing at the pain in her wrist, and headed to Lucas's home office. She opened his file cabinet, pulling out old case files. Lucas had warned her about corruption before, but now she needed proof. As she flipped through papers, she found several reports of misconduct. Officers' names blacked out, buried under layers of bureaucracy. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was an anonymous message with an attached video. She clicked it, and her breath caught. It was shaky footage of Greg shoving her in the park, clear as day. I have him, she thought, her resolve hardening. Back at the precinct, Greg Nolan paced in his office, his face taut with frustration. Officer Brown and Reed stood before him, both visibly uneasy. We need to keep a lid on this, Greg snapped, pointing a finger at Reed. No one talks. Got it. Reed shifted uncomfortably. Sir, what if someone comes forward? No one's coming forward. Greg cut him off. They know better. Brown, arms crossed, gave Reed a warning look. Just follow orders, kid. Greg smirked, leaning back in his chair. Carter's finished. Let him sit in that basement and think about his choices. He'll break eventually. Reed glanced toward the door, his expression unreadable. As Greg turned his attention to a stack of files, Reed quietly muttered, "And if he doesn't?" Greg's glare shot up like a dagger. "Then we make him." Lucas sat alone in the cold interrogation room, his body aching from hours in the metal chair. The flickering light above hummed incessantly. The door opened, and Officer Reed entered, carrying a bottle of water. Reed hesitated before walking over and setting the bottle on the table. Lucas's sharp eyes studied him. "You don't look like you believe what Greg's selling," Lucas said softly. Reed didn't respond at first. "Drink the water." Lucas ignored it. "You know he's wrong. You know I don't deserve this." Reed's hand twitched. He glanced at the door, lowering his voice. "Maybe you shouldn't have gotten involved." Lucas leaned forward, his voice firm but steady. "What would you have done if it were your wife? Would you stand by and let someone like Greg get away with it?" Reed looked away, shame flickering across his face. He stepped back toward the door, speaking just loud enough for Lucas to hear. "Stay strong, Captain," Reed whispered. Then he slipped out, leaving Lucas staring after him. For the first time since his arrest, Lucas felt a glimmer of hope. There was a crack in Greg's wall of control, and Lucas intended to break through. The door slammed open, and Greg Nolan walked into the interrogation room, flanked by Officers Reed and Brown. Lucas Carter, still handcuffed to the chair, looked up, his piercing blue eyes unwavering despite the hours of discomfort. Greg's smirk was sharp. "You know, Carter, you've always been stubborn. Let's see if we can fix that. Reed hesitated at the door, his green eyes darting between Lucas and Greg. Sir, do you really think this is necessary? Greg's glare sliced through the room. Are you questioning me, Reed? Because if you are, I'll make sure you're the next one sitting in that chair. Reed's mouth tightened, and he stepped aside. Greg turned back to Lucas. You think you're some kind of hero? Sitting there like you're untouchable? He leaned in, his voice a venomous whisper. Let's see how untouchable you really are. Greg motioned to Brown, who cracked his knuckles and advanced. Lucas braced himself. The first punch connected with his ribs, sharp pain radiating through his torso. He gasped but bit down the sound, refusing to give them the satisfaction. Brown's fists flew again, and Reed shifted uncomfortably by the wall. That's enough, Brown, Reed muttered, his voice barely audible. But Greg stepped forward, his pale blue eyes glinting with malice. No, it's not. As Brown's assault continued, Lucas focused on one thing. Isabella will find a way. Isabella paced the small, cluttered office of Claire Reynolds, Lucas's lawyer. Her wrist throbbed under the brace, but she ignored the pain, clutching the flash drive containing the video footage. I have proof, Claire, Isabella said, sliding the drive across the desk. Her voice wavered with determination. This shows everything that happened in the park. Claire plugged the drive into her laptop. The grainy video played, clearly capturing Greg shoving Isabella to the ground and Lucas intervening. Claire's lips pressed into a thin line. This is damning. But Isabella, you have to understand the risk of using this. Risk? Isabella demanded. Lucas is sitting in a basement cell right now because of Greg Nolan's lies. If I don't do something, no one will. Claire leaned back, her expression softening. You're right, but Greg has allies, and they'll push back hard. You need more than this video. We need corroboration. Isabella's fists clenched. Then I'll find it. Claire hesitated. Be careful, Isabella. This fight isn't just about Lucas. It's about the entire system he's been trying to reform. You're going to make enemies. Isabella met Claire's gaze. Let them come. Back in the cold, dimly lit basement, Lucas sat slumped in the chair. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth, and his ribs throbbed with every breath. The room was silent now, Greg and the others having left hours earlier. But Lucas wasn't broken. He closed his eyes, his mind drifting to memories of Isabella, her laughter, the way she fought for what she believed in. He thought of her resolve and felt his own strengthen. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, and the door opened to reveal Officer Reed. He entered quietly, holding a bottle of water. Reed hesitated before setting the bottle on the table. Here. Lucas lifted his head, his voice hoarse. You're better than this, Reed. Reed avoided his gaze, shifting uncomfortably. Just drink the water. Why are you here? Lucas pressed. To watch? To enable? Reed's jaw tightened. I don't agree with Greg. Okay, but what am I supposed to do? Go against him? You know what happens to guys who cross him. Lucas's voice hardened. They stand up for what's right. That's what they do. Reed stared at him for a long moment before stepping back. Stay strong, Captain, he murmured before leaving the room. Isabella sat at her dining room table, surrounded by stacks of papers and her laptop. The house felt empty without Lucas, but she pushed through the loneliness, determined to find something, anything, that could help him. Her phone buzzed with a notification. A message from an unknown number. I saw what happened in the park. I have more footage. Let me help. Isabella's heart raced. She quickly responded, arranging to meet the Cinder at a nearby cafe. The next day, a young woman with a nervous demeanor approached Isabella. She introduced herself as Riley, the bystander who had filmed the confrontation. I couldn't just stand there and do nothing, Riley said, handing over a second flash drive. I hope this helps. Isabella thanked her, her voice thick with emotion. It will. You're brave for coming forward. Back home, Isabella plugged the drive into her laptop. The new video showed Greg assaulting Lucas, a key piece of evidence that proved Lucas hadn't resisted. She called Claire immediately. I have more proof. It's time to release this. At the precinct, Greg paced his office, his phone vibrating with messages. Whispers of the video's existence had begun spreading. and his carefully constructed facade was starting to crack. Officer Brown entered, his expression grim. "Sir, there's talk about a video." Greg's eyes narrowed. "What kind of video?" Brown hesitated. "Of the park. Someone caught everything." Greg's jaw tightened. "Find out who has it and shut it down. Now." As Brown left, Greg leaned against his desk, his mind racing. He grabbed his phone and dialed a number. "Chief," Greg said, forcing calm into his voice. "There's something you need to know about Carter." But even as Greg spoke, the unease in his gut grew. He could feel the tide turning against him, and for the first time, he wasn't sure he could stop it. The early morning sunlight filtered through Isabella's curtains as she clicked the upload button on her computer. The video of Greg Nolan shoving her to the ground in the park was clear and damning. She added a brief caption, "No one is above the law. Justice for Lucas Carter." Her hands trembled as she pressed send, knowing the risks. Within minutes, notifications began to flood her phone. Messages of outrage and support poured in, accompanied by demands for accountability. Claire called almost immediately. "The video is everywhere," she said, her voice taut with urgency. "This is good. It's forcing them to respond. But you need to stay safe. Nolan won't take this lying down." "I'm ready," Isabella replied, her resolve unshakable. They can't ignore the truth now. By mid-morning, the video had gained traction on social media. News outlets began sharing it, and the hashtag Justice for Lucas started trending. Isabella refreshed her feed constantly, each new comment strengthening her determination. In the precinct, chaos erupted as officers huddled around their phones, watching the video in stunned silence. Officer Reed leaned against his desk, staring at his phone screen. The video played on a loop, Greg's aggression unmistakable. Around him, murmurs filled the precinct as other officers exchanged uneasy glances. "Reed." He turned to see Brown approaching, his jaw tight. "This is bad," Brown muttered, lowering his voice. "You think the chief's seen it yet?" Reed nodded grimly. "Probably. And Greg's gonna lose it when he finds out." Brown glanced around, ensuring no one was listening. "What are you gonna do?" "I don't know," Reed admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't keep standing by." Before Brown could respond, Greg stormed into the room, his face a mask of fury. The tension in the air thickened as he barked, "Back to work. Anyone caught gossiping about that video will answer to me." Reed and Brown exchanged a look, the cracks in their loyalty growing deeper. Chief Raymond Harris sat in his office, his steely gaze fixed on the paused frame of the video. Greg Nolan's face was unmistakable as he shoved Isabella to the ground. Harris leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he considered his next move. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Greg entered without waiting for permission, his usual smugness replaced by thinly veiled panic. "Chief, I need to talk to you about the Carter situation," Greg began, forcing a casual tone. Harris cut him off. "Sit down." Greg hesitated but complied, his hands clenched into fists. "I've received complaints, Nolan, and after seeing this video, I'm starting to think they're warranted." Harris's voice was calm but firm. "Explain yourself." Greg's jaw tightened. "That video doesn't tell the whole story. Carter interfered with my investigation and got physical. I was doing my job." Harris leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Your job? From where I'm sitting, it looks like abuse of power. And now the public's demanding answers." Greg's facade cracked for a moment before he recovered. "With all due respect, Chief, this is being blown out of proportion." Harris stood, his imposing figure towering over Greg. "If there's more to the story, you'd better hope it comes out fast. Because as of now, I'm ordering an internal review." Greg swallowed hard, his confident mask slipping further. Greg stormed out of the chief's office and into the hallway, his mind racing. His career, his control, everything was slipping through his fingers. He burst into the basement room where Lucas sat, still handcuffed but sitting tall despite his bruises. "You think you've won?" Greg spat, slamming the door behind him. "That video won't save you. No one's coming to help." Lucas met Greg's glare with calm defiance. "The truth doesn't need saving. It speaks for itself. Greg's fists clenched. You don't get it, do you? I own this place. You're nothing without that badge. Lucas tilted his head, his voice steady. And you're nothing without your lies. The words struck a nerve. Greg's face twisted with anger, but before he could respond, a knock on the door interrupted them. Reed entered, his expression unreadable. Greg, the chief wants to see you again. Now. Greg threw one last glare at Lucas before storming out. Reed lingered for a moment, his green eyes meeting Lucas's. Stay strong, Captain, he said quietly before closing the door. As evening fell, Isabella left Claire's office and drove home, exhaustion creeping into her bones. The streetlights cast long shadows across the quiet neighborhood as she pulled into her driveway. But as she stepped out of the car, a chill ran down her spine. A dark sedan idled at the end of the street, its headlights off but engine running. Isabella's heart raced as she hurried to the front door, glancing over her shoulder. The car didn't move, but the presence was unmistakably threatening. Inside, she locked the door and drew the curtains, her breath coming in short gasps. She grabbed her phone and called Claire. Claire, someone's outside my house, she whispered, peeking through the curtains. Stay inside, Claire said urgently. I'll send someone over to check it out. As Isabella hung up, she realized the stakes were higher than ever. Greg wasn't just fighting to protect himself. He was willing to destroy anyone who threatened his control. But fear couldn't stop her now. She clenched her fists, her resolve hardening. This ends here, she murmured to herself. Isabella stood in the brightly lit lobby of the police precinct, her hands trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. The officers at the front desk exchanged glances, unsure how to respond to her presence. I'm here to see Greg Nolan, Isabella announced, her voice firm despite the lump in her throat. One officer hesitated. Ma'am, this isn't. Get him, she snapped, her voice rising. Now. Greg emerged moments later, his face twisting into a smug smile. Mrs. Carter, he said, his tone dripping with condescension. What brings you here? Isabella stepped forward, her finger pointing directly at him. You think you can silence me? You think you can keep Lucas locked up and pretend like this will all go away? Greg's smile faded as officers nearby turned to watch. I suggest you calm down, he said, his voice low. Or what? Isabella challenged. You'll have me arrested too? For a moment, Greg looked around, his usual confidence wavering under the weight of the stairs. This isn't the place for this discussion. Then make it the place. Isabella shouted. Because the world knows what you've done. Everyone saw the video, Greg. You're finished. The room fell silent as her words echoed. Reed, standing near the back, clenched his fists. Even Brown shifted uncomfortably. Greg leaned in close, his voice barely audible. Careful, Mrs. Carter. You don't know who you're dealing with. I know exactly who you are. Isabella hissed back, her eyes blazing. And I'm not afraid of you. In his office, Chief Raymond Harris replayed the video for what felt like the 100th time. The growing public outcry and the tension among his officers had left him with little choice. Send Nolan in, he told his secretary. Greg entered moments later, his confidence carefully reconstructed. Chief, I can explain. You can stop right there, Harris interrupted. This precinct is under fire, Nolan. And you're at the center of it. Sir, that video was taken out of context, Greg began. Harris raised a hand, silencing him. I've reviewed your record. Complaints, cover-ups, suspicious reports. And now this. Greg's jaw tightened. You're taking Carter's side? After everything I've done for this department, I'm taking the side of justice, Harris said firmly. You're suspended, effective immediately, and there will be a full investigation into your conduct. Greg stood frozen, his hands curling into fists. You'll regret this, he muttered. Harris stared him down. Get out of my office, Nolan. Greg turned on his heel and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The basement door creaked open, and Lucas squinted against the sudden flood of light. Reed stepped inside, his expression tense. What now? Lucas asked hoarsely, his body aching from the hours of confinement. Reed hesitated, then stepped forward. I'm getting you out of here. Lucas blinked in surprise. Why now? Reed unlocked the cuffs, his voice low. Because I've had enough. You were right. Standing by makes me complicit. Lucas stood slowly, wincing at the stiffness in his muscles. What happens to you if Greg finds out? Reed shook his head. He won't have time to retaliate. The chief's taking action. Greg's suspended. Lucas's gaze hardened. That won't stop him. Reed nodded. I know. That's why you need to end this. As they stepped into the hallway, Lucas paused. Why help me now, Reed? Reed's eyes met his, guilt flickering in their green depths. Because justice doesn't mean anything if we don't fight for it. Greg paced in the precinct parking garage, his mind racing. The chief's suspension order had shaken him, but he wasn't done yet. He had one last card to play. Lucas appeared, his bruised face calm, but his piercing blue eyes blazing with determination. Greg, Lucas said evenly. Greg turned, his lips curling into a sneer. Carter, out of the dungeon. I see. Did you come to thank me for teaching you your place? Lucas stepped closer, his voice steady. You've lost, Greg. The truth is out. It's over. Greg's laughter echoed through the garage. You think this is over? You think a video and some bleeding hearts will stop me? Lucas's fists clenched, but he held his ground. This isn't about stopping you, Greg. It's about exposing the system that lets people like you thrive. Greg's expression darkened. You're so righteous, aren't you? Always playing the hero. But you're not perfect, Carter. You have skeletons too. Lucas frowned. What are you talking about? Greg's smirk returned, venomous and triumphant. My brother, James, the one you destroyed? He's your brother too. Lucas froze, the words sinking in like a blow. Surprised? Greg taunted. Your father couldn't keep his pants zipped, and my family paid the price. So don't stand there and lecture me about justice. Lucas took a steadying breath. James made his choices, and so did you. Greg stepped closer, his voice a hiss. You're just like him, a fraud, and I'll make sure the world sees it. Lucas stared him down. Do whatever you want, Greg, but justice will catch up to you. Lucas sat on the porch of his home, the night air cool against his skin. Isabella joined him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. You're home, she said softly. He nodded, his gaze distant. For now. But it's not over. She sat beside him, her fingers lacing with his. I saw Greg at the precinct. He's unhinged, Lucas. Lucas exhaled slowly. He told me something today. About James. About my father. Isabella frowned. What did he say? That James was my half-brother. Isabella's eyes widened, but she didn't let go of his hand. Does it change anything? Lucas shook his head. No, it doesn't excuse what Greg's done, and it doesn't change who I am. But it complicates things. She squeezed his hand. We'll get through this. Together. Lucas turned to her, his eyes softening. Thank you for fighting for me. Isabella smiled, her strength unwavering. Always. As they sat in silence, the weight of what was to come settled over them. But they were ready. The courtroom was packed to the brim. Reporters, members of the public, and police officers filled the wooden benches, their whispers a low hum of anticipation. At the front, Judge Franklin, a stern figure with silver hair and a sharp gaze, called the proceedings to order. Greg Nolan sat at the defendant's table, his shoulders squared but his face pale and tight. Across the aisle, Lucas Carter sat beside Isabella and Claire, his bruises faded but his resolve strong. All rise, the bailiff announced as the judge entered. Once everyone was seated, the prosecutor stepped forward. Your Honor, today we present evidence of Officer Greg Nolan's abuse of power, corruption, and physical assault against both Isabella Green and Captain Lucas Carter. The room grew still. The prosecutor's voice carried through the silence. Let the record show a video has gone viral, capturing the assault in Maplewood Park. The screen lit up, playing the footage that had ignited the firestorm. Greg's actions were clear. His shove, his aggression, and Lucas's restraint as he intervened. Whispers swept the room like a wave. Greg's attorney stood. Your Honor, the video is one-sided. It lacks context. The prosecutor turned sharply. What context could justify an officer assaulting a woman and framing her husband? The video speaks for itself, and we have testimony to confirm it. Lucas rose to the stand. His tall frame commanded attention as he sat, placing a hand on the Bible to swear his oath. "Captain Carter," the prosecutor began, "can you describe the events at Maplewood Park?" Lucas's voice was clear and steady. "My wife, Isabella, was assaulted by Officer Nolan. When I intervened to protect her, Nolan manipulated the situation, calling for backup and accusing me of interfering. I was detained, beaten, and silenced. All because I refused to let his abuse go unchecked. Why didn't you resist?" "Because I'm a police officer. I knew any sign of aggression would only make things worse. I believed the truth would come to light." Greg's attorney tried to rattle him with rapid questions, but Lucas held his ground. His calm testimony rang like a bell of truth through the room. Greg sat at the defendant's table, his lawyer whispering urgently in his ear. Sweat beaded on his forehead as the prosecution brought in a final witness, Officer Reed. Reed approached the stand hesitantly, his green eyes darting toward Greg. "Officer Reed," the prosecutor began, "you were present when Captain Carter was held in the precinct basement. What did you see?" Reed swallowed hard, his voice wavering at first but gaining strength. "I saw Officer Nolan order Captain Carter's restraint and mistreatment. He told us to teach him a lesson." The courtroom gasped. Greg shot Reed a venomous glare, but Reed kept going. "I didn't stop it," Reed admitted, his voice breaking. "And I should have. What happened was wrong." The prosecutor turned to Greg. "Officer Nolan, would you like to respond?" Greg shot to his feet, slamming his hand on the table. "This is a witch hunt," he spat. "You think Carter's a hero? He's not. You don't know what he did to my family." The courtroom erupted, Judge Franklin banging the gavel. "Order." Greg's face contorted with rage as he turned toward Lucas. "Your actions destroyed my brother. You ruined him, and now you're ruining me." Lucas stood slowly, his voice low but powerful. "Your brother made his choices, Greg, and so did you." Greg's bravado cracked as he slumped back into his seat. His attorney sat motionless, unable to salvage the moment. After hours of deliberation, the jury filed back into the courtroom. Tension hung heavy in the air as everyone waited. On the charges of abuse of power, assault, and misconduct, the foreperson began. "We find the defendant, Greg Nolan, guilty on all counts." The room erupted in a mixture of gasps, sighs of relief, and murmurs. Greg's face was ashen as he stared ahead, his fate sealed. Judge Franklin's voice rang out. "Officer Nolan, you are hereby stripped of your position and sentenced to prison for your crimes." Lucas closed his eyes briefly, a weight lifting from his shoulders. Isabella squeezed his hand, tears of relief shining in her eyes. Chief Harris stepped forward in the courtroom, addressing the officers and public. "This department will no longer tolerate abuse, corruption, or injustice. Effective immediately, we are implementing a full review of conduct and introducing systemic reforms to ensure that those who wear the badge honor it." Applause broke out, a sound that reverberated through the courtroom like a symbol of hope. Later that evening, Lucas sat alone on a bench outside the courthouse, the evening sky painted in soft oranges and purples. Greg's words echoed in his mind. "You ruined my brother." Isabella approached, sitting beside him. "You're thinking about what he said, aren't you?" Lucas nodded slowly. "It's hard to process. My father. His choices left so much damage. And Greg. He let that pain consume him." Isabella rested her head on his shoulder. "It doesn't excuse what he did, Lucas, but it explains it." Lucas's voice was quiet. "I spent my career trying to fix what's broken in the system, but I never saw the cracks in my own family." Isabella squeezed his hand. "You can't change the past, but you've made things right where it matters." Lucas turned to her, his eyes soft. "You were my strength through this, Isabella. I couldn't have done it without you." She smiled. "And I couldn't have done it without you." A week later, Lucas stood in front of a room filled with his fellow officers, reporters, and community leaders. Chief Harris stood beside him, nodding as Lucas stepped up to the podium. "Today marks a turning point," Lucas began. For too long, power has been misused and trust broken. It's time we hold ourselves to the standards we swore to uphold, to protect and serve, not control and silence. The room was silent, listening intently. Lucas continued, "Change doesn't happen overnight. It's built by people who choose to stand for what's right, even when it's hard. It starts with us." The crowd erupted into applause. Officers approached Lucas afterward, shaking his hand with newfound respect. Reed was among them. "Captain," Reed said quietly, "I'm sorry for everything. You showed me what integrity looks like." Lucas nodded. "It's not too late to make a difference, Reed. Do the right thing from here on out." As Lucas left the podium, Isabella waited for him outside the precinct. The sun bathed the steps in golden light, illuminating them both. "Ready to go home?" she asked, her smile soft. Lucas looked at her, his heart full. "Let's go." They walked hand in hand, leaving behind the shadows of the past and stepping into a future defined by hope, justice, and love.